smallholder operations are much more integrated into the natural economy of growing food. And industrial operations are dedicated to the world of turning animals into widgets. It isn't just introducing economies at scale, introducing diseconomies in scale, that when you get bigger, you make things worse. So in the course of getting bigger, we selected for pathogens that may emerge and kill 1 billion people.
Welcome to another episode of the Agroecology Radio Hour, your monthly podcast that explores the issues of food sovereignty in the Australian landscape. I'm your host, Lucy Ridge, speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Today we are speaking with Rob Wallace. He is an evolutionary epidemiologist at the Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corps. He is the author of Big Farms Make Big Flu, and most recently, The Fault in Our SARS. He is also co-author of the more technical monographs Neoliberal Ebola and Clear-Cutting Disease Control. Wallace has consulted for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the CDC, and the People's CDC. Welcome, Rob.
Hello, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So often when we introduce guests on the podcast, we like to invite them to tell us where they are at the moment and what's happening on that country. What's it like where you are right now?
Well, I'm here in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's the northern state here in the United States in the Midwest, and looks like all the snow has melted away here, but it snowed yesterday, which I'm actually quite happy about, given that winter is beginning to disappear from all our landscapes. It's nice to see the cold and the snow.
Absolutely. Wow. Feels very, very far away from where we are in Australia right now. It's been very warm where I am recently. So, Rob, you've studied avian flu extensively, and we're currently seeing a rise of cases of avian flu across the globe. Can you explain just a little bit about what it is and how it spreads?
Yes, well, avian influenza is indeed an influenza, and it's ostensibly a respiratory infection, but it also can spread through the intestinal tract as well. And it's a virus that's been around for many thousands of years, primarily in wild waterfowl. Typically, when all the different types of wild waterfowl, geese and ducks and the like, they migrate up to the North Pole there, and they hang out and they infect each other with different strains of influenza. Typically, though, it's not too much of a damage to them, although there are historically been some bad outbreaks among wild waterfowl. But for the hundreds of years, in the past couple hundred years, there haven't been any documented really bad outbreaks among wild waterfowl until the H5N1 emerged in China in 1996, and we'll get to that story in due course. But for the most part, these wild waterfowl act as reservoirs for the different strains. And you have different strains because the influenza genome is segmented, meaning its DNA is, in fact, it's more RNA. But for our purposes, to understand the genetic sequences are segmented, and if a bird is infected by two different strains, the strains can exchange their segments like card players on a Saturday night. Mm. So you have all these kind of license plate numbers like H5N1 and H5N7 and H7N9. The H refers to hemagglutinin. That's the protein that allows the virus to enter into the host cell. And N stands for neuraminidase, which is the protein that allows the virus to exit the cell after it's reproduced itself inside the host cell. So you have these license plate numbers, H5N1, H7N9. And so when a bird is infected by two different strains, they can swap their genome segments there, and you can have a H5N1 and an H7N9 swap and produce an H5N9 that hadn't been there before. Mm. And so as an RNA virus, it can evolve really fast, unlike our DNA, where we have these kind of spell checkers that fix any mutations. RNA doesn't really have that. So along with the capacity to swap these segments, you're talking about something of an evolutionary machine. And it's also very short generation time. So you have an infection in a matter of days. It takes you and I, if we're interested in reproduction, about 20, 25 years to produce somebody. For them, it's a matter of days. And so you have this short generation time, this lack of spell checking on the genetic code, and then the swapping. And so it is a hard charging evolutionary machine in such a way that when the going gets rough, and in the sense of there's a lot of organisms to infect, it can burn through a whole population in a matter of days, and then it can kill a lot of organisms in short order if it has to. So the shock of the moment of the last 25 years is the way that this bird flu has suddenly has this capacity to spill over into other organisms, including human beings. And so in 1996, 97, when this bird flu, this H5N1, arrived in Hong Kong and began to spill over into humans, and to that point, that wasn't expected. There was no notion that a bird flu can go directly into humans, and it killed about 18 people, infected a whole bunch more, and there was a deep concern, and that all of a sudden we were on the precipice of a new pandemic. Now, we have all suffered that the last couple of years.
Yes, we're very well versed in pandemics now.
Right. So along with on record, something like 15 million, but if you count excess deaths, we're at like 27 million people died from COVID-19. But that was a case fatality rate about 2%. So 2% of people were infected died from it. With H5N1, certainly in the early days, the first 5 years of it, the case fatality rates were 60%.
Wow.
So now we're really concerned about something that goes human to human and maintains, if not 60%, even something like 20% or 15%, you would have a lot more people that die from such a pandemic than from COVID-19, which was a devastating pandemic as it was.
Yeah, and it's a very scary prospect. So something that we often sort of hear in mainstream media is that free-range poultry farms are to blame for the spread of avian flu because of their interaction with wild populations. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how avian flu will behave differently in free-range versus industrial-type shed systems, and how pastured systems and agroecological systems kind of fit into that landscape too.
All right. So that gets us circling back to that story I promised about how, for the most part, wild waterfowl weren't really badly affected by the bird flus that they carried. And it was only until after the H5N1 emerged in southeastern China in 96 that all of a sudden you had flocks of wild waterfowl die in massive numbers from bird flu that they previously were just asymptomatic reservoirs. Now, how did that happen? Well, it had to do largely with the understanding that when bird flu spilled over into industrial populations of birds, that increased or selected for the amount of virulence or deadliness of the pathogens. And the story goes this way. If you're a virus, you don't want to kill your host until you get into the next host. So there's a cap on how much of a badass you can be, meaning you can only replicate in the host up to the point where you get the threshold of infection that you can subsequently cause symptoms and enter into the next host. If you do that too fast before the next host comes around, you've killed your host and you can't make the infection. You can't make the transmission. Mm-hmm. So there is an evolutionary cap on how deadly you can be, because the faster you replicate in a host, the more damage you do, the increasing likelihood that you kill your host. In an industrial population of birds, the hosts are right there.
Yeah.
You're packed in 15,000 turkeys, 250,000 layers. And they're all genetically the same because they've been bred that way. And they've been bred for morphometric characteristics like bigger breasts and faster growth. So there's not much genetic variation in terms of their immune response. So a virus that gets into a barn of 250,000 layers is all food for flu. And those strains that can get to that replication threshold in their bird as fast as they can, or those strains that win out and beat out the other strains in terms of the evolutionary game that they're having with other strains. So you select for virulence, you select for deadliest, because you're selecting for the speed to get to the replication threshold to spill over into other birds and burn through that barn. Now, it isn't just the barn, because, in terms of industrial production, there are the economies of scale in operation.
Yeah.
So you have, typically you have a lot of barns clustered together in certain parts of the country or state or province, because you don't want to have trucks having to have to, go hundreds of kilometers just to get from one barn to another, right? So you have them all clustered together, so you can just come in with your trucks, swoop up a whole bunch of birds ready to be processed, and get out of town to the processing plant. So a lot of the farms are clustered together, so that once you get burn out through a barn, then you're able to get to the next barn from the virus vantage point in short order. So the very structure of the industry is dedicated to selecting for virulent pathogens. So what happened in China and elsewhere is that when the pathogen gets into an industrial operation, increases in virulence and then blows back out, not only into smallholder operations, but also onto wild waterfowl. And the way the industry handles all this is by blaming the wild waterfowl and the smallholders for this, because smallholders aren't engaged in the kind of so-called biosecurity that the industrial barns are doing. But you don't really need that. Typically, for thousands of years, smallholders didn't need the kind of industrial level of biosecurity, because they weren't selecting for the damage of virulence that the industrial barns produced. So now smallholders are not only getting the blame, but the blowback from the kind of evolutionary biology that's these industrial operations are supporting. And the way I succinctly summarize what I've just told you, and I do have some other points I want to add to this in terms of how industrial production leads to increased in deadliness and infectiousness. But the way I summarize things is that in the course of industrializing husbandry, we industrialized the pathogens that were circulating among the animals.
Yeah.
And smallholders didn't have anything to do with that, except, of course, as to be the punching bags that the industry attempted to, as a matter of convenience, as a way of demonstrating, because of the industrial production of pathogens, therefore we need to get rid of smallholders in order to have the biosecurity necessary to protect ourselves against the pathogens that the industry developed in the first place.
Wow.
So let me circle back. I do want to offer some other points, because it really speaks at why the smallholder and the agroecological approaches are essential to fixing this problem.
Yeah, because if we have, smallholders and agroecological systems who have greater genetic diversity and greater, spacing, less density in their stocking, does that mean that we could potentially see, maybe if a flu did come through those systems, those animals might be healthier and more able to cope?
Right. So there's a couple things going on. There's to add to the problem with the industrial stuff, and there's the fact that you have so many animals stuffed in. They have 6-week lifespans. They're basically, we're talking about chickens and the like, but for hogs, I think it's like 22 weeks. I mean, you're just jamming them in short order, and it's a really stressful environment. I'm not an animal rights activist, but it's clearly a terrible place for an animal to be. A devastating impact on their immune system and the capacity to deal with it. So reduce the capacity to deal with infection that is already being selected for deadliness. But in addition, there's no. Suppose there are a couple birds that survive an outbreak in an industrial barn, and so there's stragglers there, and there's pictures and video of this where you just all the birds in a barn are dead from this virus. You have a couple stragglers there. Like, why is that? This could be just blind luck. But it could be a matter of some quirk in their immune system that allowed them to survive the infection. We would probably maybe want to use those birds as the progenitors of the next generation.
Yeah.
Because some quirk, but that's the problem. In industrial production, there is no reproduction on site.
Yeah.
All the breeding is done offshore at the grandparent level. for what I previously discussed, the morphometric characteristics of vast growth and bigger breasts and the like, so that you can't do anything about it. In other words, they've removed the ecosystem service of natural selection from the industrial production.
Yeah, so there can be no natural resistances formed because there's always that circuit breaker of new eggs coming into the system.
Exactly right. And so this is what the agroecological approach, the smallholder approach, already an operation. You don't have to do anything special. You're already doing it. Smallholder operations are much more integrated into the natural economy of growing food. And industrial operations are dedicated to the world of turning animals into widgets. So you're interested in the world of producing enormous profits, even if at the expense of the natural animalness of the organisms involved, or the ecology of the landscape.
Yeah.
And so smallholder operations on a landscape, as you were describing, the diversity of animals wouldn't be just on farm, but across farms. So you could have, and that, ostensibly is just a emergent property of smallholder operations doing their own thing, like we want to do this way. But it could also be a matter of regional planning if you wanted to do that way. But if you have regional agrobiodiversity across a landscape, it acts as a immune circuit break, a fire break upon the evolution of the pathogen. A pathogen that solves a particular chicken breed in terms of even if the even if the genetic diversity is very limited, even if you can solve that one, you have all sorts of different other breeds across the landscape. And so a pathogen that blows through that with great virulence and deadliness has nowhere else to go because the other pathogens, the other organisms are quite different from them. Now, we've got a problem, however, with this. And I still very much adhere to this model of it, that an agroecological approach is the way to go. We have the problem in that industrial agriculture has so permitted the virulent pathogens, influenza and African swine fever, all sorts of different types.
Yeah.
Even Ebola. There's a pig version of Ebola circulating in the Philippines. Certainly the coronaviruses have spilled over into hog and other animals. COVID-19 is ended up in humans, but had it start circulating among bats and spilling over into local flocks and herds and farm workers on the edge of the forest there in China and other parts of Southeast Asia. So, but the problem is all of a sudden here, and this is why I've, although working for 5 years on COVID, I'm suddenly back working on bird flu stuff because in late 2023, all of a sudden, well, before that, about 2022, you had all sorts of H5N1, meaning you have the H5 and the hemagglutinin that we were talking about, and then the N, you had all sorts of different types of Ns. So all sorts of neuraminidase were circulating with that H5 and trading card players. And so you had H and 2 and 3 and 7 and 9, all sorts of ones.
So all sorts of different strains intermingling, crossing paths. Yeah.
That's right. And so they were allowed to do, and suddenly it got this capacity to start spreading over into mammals in a way that it didn't before. So you had all sorts of marine mammals, seals and the like get infected in a way that hadn't been the case before. You have all sorts of beaches filled with dead seals and the like, all along the South American coastline, up and down. And then eventually at the end of, this is a very long story made short, but at the end of 2023, you had the spillover into cow herds in the United States, which was just unheard of. We had no concept of this. And then by the early 2024, it started pinging up and down across the networks of cow herds and cattle and dairy herds across the U.S. And then from there, spilling back over into birds and infecting cats, infecting farm workers. And, they estimated only 70 farm workers have been infected, but it's probably a lot more than that, in part because the testing is non-existent here in the United States, which is increasingly devolving out from the nation state. It's becoming, it's abandoning the public health model. It's abandoning the notion of the public commons. This started 40 years ago, the institution of neoliberal model of economics, but has accelerated. Certainly COVID showed the U.S. incapable of responding with the scale of intervention necessary to deal with the scale of a problem, of a pandemic.
And which then, of course, further erodes the trust in the system, which then furthers the problem, right? It's a kind of a downward spiral.
Yes, yeah. So, and there is a notion of public trust, but there is a very much a material underlying state we are here in the United States. So, I mean, Trump is the epitome is the denouement of this whole process, but it was ongoing for decades, and COVID underscored where we are in our circuit of accumulation. And I want to speak the cycle of accumulation. Excuse me. I want to speak a little bit about this because it speaks to why the U.S. is incapable of dealing with a pandemic or a proto-pandemic like H5N1 that's presently circulating, and why the richest country in the history of the world is dissolving on the weekly basis at this point. Maybe it sounds like a over the top thing, and I can misstep on that account, but I don't think I am on this one. I mean, there has a certain smell about it that is disturbing. So cycles of accumulation. There are what are called world systems theorists, and they have an idea of the nature of capitalism, and their sense of it, historical model of it is that empires go in this cycle of accumulation. In the front side of the accumulation, they turn money into capital, and they build out imperial infrastructure, including horrible things like invading armies and the like, but also things like public health infrastructure and things like that. And then on the far side of the accumulation, when they're not able to invade elsewhere and continue to grab resources and turn them into lucrative commodities, they start falling. The empire starts falling apart. And so the empire turns capital back into money. And what I'm getting at is the rich people start to cash out. And so this is our interpretation here of what's happening. And so historically speaking, that as you start off with the Italian city-states, they come and go, and then the Spanish take over in terms of their empire, followed by the Dutch Empire, followed by the Brits, and then the United States, right? Whether or not if the U.S. crashes out here, whether or not another country will step in is a good question, whether it's the Chinese or someone else. People have described it that we are ecologically not in any position to be able to have another cycle of accumulation. Ecologically speaking, we've reached the various precipices that mean we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet because we are up against these.
Depleted those resources.
Right. So the U.S. appears to be on its far cycle, end of the cycle. It is cashing out. The rich are taking all the money and are basically destroying the public commons that say, even as Australia sometimes wants to see itself in the mirror of the U.S., some of its more conservative politicians, I assure you don't want to become what we are becoming. The very things that you take for granted in terms of your Social Security, your health care, and all this. We don't even have a healthcare system in that way. So all those things are being sold off. All those things are being retired. All those things, HIV prevention is being gutted. CDC has been stripped out. We have 10,000, 20,000 workers to be fired from our health and health departments, or federal health departments, things like that. So they are closing up shop here rapidly in short order. And so this has a profound effect, integrated with the COVID moment, integrated with the H5N1 moment, because even as Biden on his way out tried to give some money dedicated to following up on what bird flu was doing, largely very little money, very little work being done. Agribusiness is in the driver's seat in determining what public health does. That's not something specific to the U.S. It's that has been a long, ongoing problem for hundreds of years. This fight between public health and agriculture. And for long stretches of time, agriculture usually wins the day because it's such a powerful sector, not just in the U.S. but elsewhere. So public health often put in the back seat until you have a terrible outbreak spillover, and then all of a sudden they call on the public health people to clean up the mess.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about externalizing the damage of a system of production. So that's where we are here in the U.S. in that part of it. So we're not even keeping track really of. There's some of that keeping track of what herds are infected and flocks, but that data is also often covered up in It's not a conspiracy. It's more policy.
Yeah.
This began under the Obama years of when swine flu H1N1 2009 spilled over into turned into a pandemic from the various industrial swine farmers stopped reporting in whether or not their herds were being infected. And so what the CDC and the USDA did here was cut a deal with them. We say, you report to us and we won't share it with anybody else.
Right.
So there was a kind of anonymity that was built into it, but to the great damage of not just the rest of us, but other farmers as well, because you kind of want to know if John down the road has an infected herd.
Yeah, that's important.
Only for your own herd, but for the bigger picture of the public health system, and also for the health and well-being of the swine herds and the poultry flock.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's hard to. If we've gotten to the point that we typically talk about swine flu and bird flu as if they're separate things, but as I was describing how the spillover is going, it's increasingly they're becoming not so separated out by separated out by the host species anymore, which is a very difficult position for any kind of control efforts, because it basically means one would have to do a considerable amount of biocontrol, even preventive biocontrol, including culling animals. And typically, if you had separated it out to a species level in terms of, say, chickens or layers or something, then that would be something that you could get your mind wrapped around in terms of governance and intervention.
Yeah.
But when you increase the possibility of spilling it into multiple species, and that becomes a whole different operation.
Yeah, totally.
So, but to speak to your question, I'm sorry, I tend to wander about a little bit because these questions have so interconnected in so many different ways, as they should be in terms of when we talk about them, that we can get lost in all sorts of different directions. However, to your question about, well, what does this have to do with smallholders, and does a smallholder model speak to having to better respond to such outbreaks? If you were moving in a direction that is absolutely anathema to most of the world, like the notion of increasing the number of farmers, like we've been using for hundreds of years to get away from that, reducing the number of farmers, moving toward consolidation, moving toward fewer farmers that have more acreage to produce more of the monocrops and monoculture herds and flocks that speak to the economies of scale.
In Australia, we say get big or get out. That's the phrase that gets thrown around a lot. Yeah.
It is a U.S. thing too as well. Yeah. So some phrases become internationalized, and we should internationalize other things like get small and get more. You can have, so this notion of repeasantization, having more farmers, getting back into, and not to be, we're not being waxing nostalgic here, which is a very practical issue about the nature of production and the future coming up, the climate change that's incoming, the necessity for, reconnecting our economies to our ecologies in such a way that we can make our way through the dangers of the coming age. climate change, the age of pandemics, the flooding, the droughts. All these things are going to require more of an agroecological approach that permits healthier soils. It's not just the nutrition of the food and the mineral and the like. It's the sopping up of the floods, the capacity of soil to retain moisture during droughts. I mean, this is like so. This is all brass tacks. This is all. Originally I'm from New York City, which may explain why I'm yapping a lot. But in addition, I ended up here in the Midwest, as we described at the top of the hour, here in St. Paul. And what's maybe a delightful thing about being here is I've kind of taken on the more pragmatic notions of like why are we doing what we're doing. Obviously I'm very clear, perhaps to some of my colleagues' consternation about objections to the nature of capitalism and the like and what it does. It isn't just introducing economies at scale; it's introducing diseconomies in scale. That when you get bigger, you make things worse. So in the course of getting bigger, we selected for pathogens that may emerge and kill 1 billion people. I find it a problem, and I'd like to interrupt that, please.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But it goes in the other direction as well. That in the course of I'm going to say my piece, and then I want to walk it back, but in an interesting way. I want to say by getting smaller, we're going to get better, and that's not to say, and this is the walk back, is that it doesn't mean that we don't have problems as smallholders. Like you can have an operation poorly run and have outbreaks and problems. Everybody knows people who have fallen off the farm because it's really hard to be a farmer.
Yeah.
I'm not a farmer, but I know enough farmers, and I know the difficulties they have, and I know even the best suffer terrible things. I mean, it is an extraordinary thing to do, to churn, dirt and a couple seeds and a couple hatchlings into this magical thing of nutrition and all sorts of animals across a large landscape. It's quite something. And it's not easy because, as we were speaking about, it's a natural economy. You are working with climate and soils and animals that don't necessarily cooperate with you. No matter how much of the of the breeding we've done, no matter how much of the thousands of years of knowledge about these things, no matter how much, even if you were involved in a farm collective and then being able to have a grain storage of your seed for one season to the next, even if you have all these wonderful buffers that as a community you build into things, and you should, because you are engaged in work that is by nature uncooperative.
Yeah.
Meaning the seeds don't always sprout, the animals don't always hatch, the whole difficulty of that. It's not making widgets, as we were talking about. And you don't want to make them as widgets, because in the course of doing things like that, then you cause the diseconomies at scale that we are trying to get away from. So those are smallholder operations and communities of farmers, the neighborhoods of farms that operate together, are in the position to be able to push back against a lot of the worst of the problems. And so, as we were getting at, the agrobiodiversity across the landscape does have the potential built in to disrupt the evolution of the pathogens. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be outbreaks, and it doesn't mean that it's you're going to be free and clear of all pathogens and pests and things like that. And but there are agroecological approaches that would minimize some of these things. That you can have, even the fact that your flocks and herds can reproduce on site acts as a kind of in real time natural selection. Natural resistance that you were talking about to this. At a moment in which you have a bird flu that whacks all animals, that's a hard thing to do, imagine. So we're talking long-term switcheroo into a model that would, in essence, develop a détente with pathogens. You don't defeat viruses and bacteria. You try to maneuver them in the part of the parameter space that minimizes the worst of outbreaks, and minimizes in terms of how deadly they are and how many other animals that they infect, or how many, and there's crop versions of this as well.
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
so in other
It's
words,
all so
we do.
interconnected. It's so,
Yes, very much
it's
so.
fascinating.
And it really is a world possibilities in terms of an agroecology, of thinking through about what kind of world that we can build from this, and step out of the kind of alienation that the capitalist markets have imposed on everyone, including farmers, in terms of our relationship to the work we do, to the food we produce. We do want to feed people. We do have bills to pay. That we're not, this isn't some kumbaya thing, although that's part of it as well. We do have our relationship with the soil and the landscape. I know many farmers who are truly moved by the work they do in terms of being able to, raise animals, to be out in the field and all those kinds of things. So that is part of it as well. But we have along the way, in the course of the industrial revolution in agriculture, we have what we lost wasn't just the narrative of food, although we have in the last 25 years begun to kind of crawl back and try to capture more of that again, and have a greater proportion of the population appreciate the nature of an agroecological approach to producing food. But we are up against a multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to trying to promote the latest and greatest of in industrial and chemical production of food, that we end up losing out on the possibilities of what the imaginarium, how we can imagine what kind of landscape we would be able to produce, and what kind of social system that respects the kind of food production that treats the animals and the people involved as a kind in a way as possible that has a functional aspects to it for sure, but is speaking to the larger picture of generations beyond where we are. And certainly the Native Americans speak about 7 generations from here in terms of what decisions we make, right? Instead of, carbon mining whole landscapes, stripping out the whole area, and then engaging in what's called a spatial fix, meaning you just move to the next area and strip that part out as well.
Yeah. So
we
obviously
live
we're talking about sort of specifically in avian flu systems and how we can move beyond that with an agroecological approach. But, we know that avian flu outbreaks, it's much bigger than just eggs shortages. It's much bigger than just,
right.
Just the birds. And obviously you've spoken about it moving into other animals. But I wonder if we then look at other infrastructure and other intensive farming systems. In Australia, we're looking at really intensive salmon farming operations in Tasmania, which are causing a lot of problems. We're looking at abattoir shortages. We're looking at all sorts of other intensive farming systems that are starting to break down. And I wondered if you could speak to how we can sort of take the lessons that we're learning from one outbreak or one disease and apply it across a few different other systems.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, this is not just bird flu. I mean, this is all sorts of other outbreaks. I mentioned African swine fever, and there are all sorts of streptococcus bacterial outbreaks. There's, it happens. There's a laundry list. I mentioned Ebola. There was an outbreak among Philippine hog in this direction. So. You mentioned the salmon. The salmon farming is also driven by industrial outbreaks. I mean, it's extraordinary. So it doesn't speak necessarily just the individual species involved. It's the problems in the business model, and the problem is, like when I spoke about the removal of natural selection as a resource for immune resistance, natural resistance. That's built into the model before a single animal's grown out. I mean, you're not letting animals reproduce on site on large industrial farms. So you already stripped out natural selection from the beginning. It doesn't mean that we want our birds to be subjected to outbreaks. This is not the, one wants to filter that out as much as possible. But we're just saying that if it happens, you are in a position to try to, fold in some a next step in there that permits the possibility of better protecting your animals.
Yeah.
Certainly feeding your animals well, treating them right, raising them at densities that are not so tightly bound that the animal's immune systems go kaput, even for something that isn't as deadly.
Yeah.
So, the well-being of the animals are integrated to the well-being of the landscape and then the capacity of the farmer to be able to pay their bills and not be confronted by, mortgage payments in the next quarter and not be confronted by the tournament that some of the industries subject their farmers to, not to be, it's so bad. It's so bad that the, here in the U.S., the industry isn't totally vertically integrated. There's one part of the production that they spooled out onto a contract basis, and that's the growing out of the animals, what we think of as farming, right? The reason is that because 30 years ago, they realized that when you raise animals at such densities that they suffer psychopathologies and infectious diseases to the point that all the losses they wanted to get off their balance sheet. So by contracting out to farmers, those contract farmers bear the cost of the model of production. This is all very well thought out, and it's been thought out for many decades. So, so it then gets into, well, how are farmers able to get out from underneath that? Because you could be a regenerative farmer or agroecological farmer and still be beholden to industrial inputs or industrial processors. So this has happened here in the United States during the COVID outbreak. In the 60s, it was a kind of a next stage of the jungle. The Sinclair, the book that shocked the U.S. in the early 1900s about what was going on in meat processing plants. And so there was a second wave of reforms that happened in the 60s where a lot of the locally owned abattoirs were basically retired and subjected to larger industrial processing plants were built in that was at that time subjected to intense USDA inspections. That since has devolved into, we'll inspect ourselves. Thank you very much. But what happened during COVID, and this is the interesting thing where you have these different pandemics or proto-pandemics speak to each other. But the COVID outbreaks did such damage to the meat packing operations that some of these meat packing operations had to close down for a while. It didn't just affect industrial hog and poultry farmers, and it affected smallholders and more agroecological producers as well, because they had nowhere to process their own animals. And all of a sudden, strangely enough, Republican governors of Midwest states started to say and support things that we never imagined them to say, which is to support the notions of local abattoirs being built out.
Yeah.
So this is the thing, the notion, or any of this that we describe, the agroecological game plan that we laid out here today in terms of increasing agrobiodiversity across landscapes and all that depends on locus of control, the capacity of farmers and farming communities to make decisions about what to grow, how to grow it, how to process it, and where to sell it. Where your end buyers, who you're selling it to. And it's not always easy. Here in the U.S., some farmers who went all out on the regenerative plan in terms of growing, but the farms, particularly, say in the Great Plains areas, Kansas, Nebraska, much larger, so you can have a mid-sized operation doing 50,000 bushel of white carrot. But where are you going to sell this thing? You can't just back up into a local hospital parking lot and dump it there for them. Your institutional buyers, local ones. You can't do it at a farmer's market. You can't do
Yeah.
it. So, in other words, you developed a new problem of like, how do we build out, agroecological markets to sop up
Yeah.
all the wonderful food that we're growing, and how do we process these things? So,
Yeah, there's sort of that
if you want,
infrastructure bottleneck at the moment. We've got that repeasantization, those agroecological smallholders, farmers, and we've got a market of people who really want to, be eating better, who are interested in food and health and where their food is coming from. But if we don't have the infrastructure to as you say, process and then get that food to market, those two things can't coexist. So it's also about that middle.
yeah, and it's hard to be, and in essence, what we're describing here is with the need to go to do what is a regime shift from one type of production to another, right? And it isn't just what you do on farm. Like it's wonderful that farmers are trying to make the switcheroo from maybe they had done conventional production before and now they're doing ecological approach, but it's a food system thing, right?
Yeah.
And so we have interviewed farmers here in the U.S. where you have a farmer who's more regenerative side of things and agroecological side of things, and they're like one of the few in the entire county which is largely conventional. So you can do everything you can up to your farm gate, but unless there's a food system out there, then you're screwed. If you are, even if there's a quorum of agroecological farmers in an area, that's not enough. You need to have the food system shift in a way that you can engage in the aggregation and the processing necessary to turn your food into food. I know it's a weird thing to say, but turn in your crops and your livestock and flocks into actual food that people can eat. And I explained about the farmer backing into the hospital.
Yeah.
Meaning hospitals are institutions that would wonderfully be able to buy into a lot of this. But what we're in, and I think you described it well, it's a bottleneck of making that transition. And sometimes the transitions can happen easily, if only, right, all the time, right? And sometimes they take a while, but if you do it, I think I can. And then the whole group of farmers and processors can make their way to that. Sometimes it might be a system in which people can work their asses off in trying to make this happen. And they're up against, some ghost in the machine of it all that makes it very hard to ever get to that spot.
Yeah.
And
legislative barriers, political barriers, all of this.
And who shows up and how it happens? Can you organize people? And it's not even anything that anybody does. Yeah, I mean, I don't. And the things that you describe are exactly correct. But in addition to all that, there's not to be magical about it, but there are aspects of the making it happen that extend out our beyond our capacity. Whether a natural scientist like myself or a farmer or a cook like yourself, the notion of what we can actually accomplish. We have great senses of our notion that with great diligence and hard work that we can get something done. And of course, those things are absolutely necessary, but they're not always sufficient. Some things get out from underneath us. So those are the heartbreaking examples, right? Yeah. But it really speaks to the contingency of it all, as much as running a farm is basically cycles of contingency. Like what kind of rain comes this year? What's the state of the market this year? Who's buying? I had this wonderful institutional buyer this year who basically tapped out for the next year. The cycles of contingency of not knowing exactly what might happen coming up also infiltrate the notions of the regime shifts that we want to go through, from changing our farm system or food system in the area from this thing into something else. And it's hard, difficult work, but none of this can happen unless the farmers and the local farm community have the capacity to make decisions about what they do and how. And so building out abattoirs on site is, getting back farmers into position to make decisions about how to process their herds and flocks are an important part of this. Whether they want to do it on farm or they have more of a collective operation somewhere down the road. These are things that are a fundamental part of us being able all to move from one system presently that is at one and the same time losing the story of food, meaning the industrial system is losing that story, but also has considerable amount of money and power that you described that gets in the way of it being replaced. And that is the generational battle that we're confronted with in the years ahead and at a moment in which Earth's ecosystemic barriers are coming up against them in such a way that we need the ecological approach in order for humanity to survive.
Absolutely. And collectivizing is so important as part of that. That's how we do it. Wow. Well, that's been fascinating and just incredible to chat to you, Rob. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that we haven't covered yet?
No, I think that's it. I think
we've done it.
Covered a lot today.
We did. We did.
Hey, this is all done here. Let me go on. We can go on to the next world problem. But
that's it. We fixed it.
Exactly.
Excellent.
All right. Well, wonderful talking to you today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Agroecology Radio Hour. If you'd like to support AFSA's work, please head to our website, afsa.org.au, where you can become a member or follow the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance on social media. You can also sign up as a subscriber to this podcast on buymeacoffee.com and contact us via our email address, australian.food.sovereignty@gmail.com. Thanks to our producer Ivan Blackett and our guest Rob Wallace. We'll put relevant links in the show notes if you'd like to know more about Rob's work. And if any of these issues are impacting you as a small-scale producer, join AFSA. Get involved, get in touch, we can all help together. And of course, please share this podcast with your networks to help grow the food sovereignty movement in Australia and beyond. Viva!